The old wrinkled fingers clutched shut around the necklace while the other hand migrated to the exposed scalp to brush the hair over it again. Cassidy's grandmother seemed lost in another world beyond this small, cozy room. I was convinced the old woman was bluffing, and that I could make it right if I could just talk to Colin. The happy ending I'd been promised could still happen. I was carrying his child, after all. The old witch wouldn't allow me near him, though, and began to spread malicious lies about my honor. My own father was furious that I could have shamed our family. So in disgrace, I left in the night, stealing away with my precious cargo inside of me and the necklace around my neck. My journey to America, the land of opportunity and dreams, was hard and lonely, making the curse more real to me. I never found love again, except in my son and you, of course. Now with your father's love life in shambles and your departure, the curse seems more real than ever. Grandma, you can't really believe the curse is real. Dad made his own mistakes, and I'm being transplanted across the country because of the family court judge. None of that's your fault. If anything, the blame should lie on Colin. He's the one that did not take the responsibility he should have. Cassidy tried to comfort her grandma, who seemed to wither in despair. But if I had just let go of my pride and let go of the cursed necklace, none of this would have happened. I have this haunting feeling that the old hag is going to be at my deathbed to reclaim it. She twisted the necklace in anxiety, then shook her head at her own foolishness. I know that's a silly thought, and I'm just a silly old woman. She stroked the necklace adoringly, kissing it gingerly. I told you this story because I want you to have the necklace, to keep a part of me and of our history with you. It's a family heirloom, and you're entitled to it just as much, if not more, than that old hag. It may turn out to be a burden, but it's our burden to bear. But I must warn you, be wary of those with greedy eyes who'd love to steal such a beautiful treasure. With those words, the old woman unclasped the necklace and handed it to her beloved granddaughter sitting across from her. As Cassidy fastened the necklace around her slender neck, it seemed as though the gold made the colors of her hair shine more brilliantly. The blonde hair that mixed so effortlessly with the customary Scottish red seemed to dazzle from the glow of the fire, just like the gold on the necklace. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment before the elderly woman reached for her knitting needles. Cassidy watched as the needles moved soundlessly and rapidly, coiling the yarn around the metal, then weaving it into the larger work. She began to hum a lullaby that she had always sung to put Cassidy to sleep as a child. With such a sweet melody, the comfort of the oversized chair, and the crackle of the fire, Cassidy began to drift to sleep, thinking of Scotland and the incredible strength of her grandmother that made Cassidy admire her more than ever. She let the idea of the dreaded trip to Washington slide out of her consciousness so she could enjoy this last lullaby. The morning ride to the airport brought a tearful goodbye as Cassidy prepared to leave the only home she'd ever known. At the door to the airport, she hugged her father and grandmother goodbye, promising she'd be back soon. As she turned to leave, her grandmother stopped Cassidy once more and handed her a ruby-colored hat that she had been knitting the night before. It's not my finest work, but hopefully you can put it to good use where you're going. Remember that I love you, dearly, and nothing will ever change that fact. The tears Cassidy had managed to withhold before came gushing like a broken dam. She hugged her grandmother tightly, hoping the old woman could feel all her love and sadness in that embrace. Waving goodbye from the entrance, Cassidy put on the knit hat and a brave face, trying to make it to the terminal without any additional waterworks. Weeks passed in the rainy city of Seattle, but Cassidy still could not get accustomed to her new life and newly formed family. Long gone were the days of fairy tales and fireside chats. Fantasy wasn't practical to her mother or stepdad either. Her mother was still the same as always, driven and ambitious to obtain the good life. She tried to buy Cassidy's happiness with trinkets, clothes, and electronics, yet nothing seemed to take away the young girl's longing for her home back east. Money had never been as readily available as now, but it didn't give Cassidy the solace that one single night with her grandmother could provide. The only present that the girl cherished was an iPod, which she'd load with music to drown out the present and her sorrows. When she felt overwhelmed, she'd put on her knitted hat from her grandmother, pop in her earphones, and wander the woods behind her new house, positioned on the edge of town. The silence of the forest and the overwhelming sense of seclusion calmed her soul. She wondered if there were forests like this in Scotland, if the all-encompassing green was the same as the rolling hills in her grandmother's childhood. She'd wander with stories of kelpies and sprites replaying in her mind, becoming so real at points she could swear the forest was hiding secrets of magic whenever she'd turn her head. The weeks stretched on until the day when Cassidy received a call from her father, his voice crackling as he told her of his mother's passing. He had found her sitting next to the fire, knitting needles in hand, looking peaceful. I think she was dreaming of her Scotland, he said, implying that she had finally been able to return home. I know you want to say goodbye, but there isn't another flight for a couple days. I'm sorry your first visit has to be this way, Cass. You know, she really loved you." Cassidy couldn't believe that her grandma was just gone. No warnings, besides her increasing age. She was just gone, like a candle being blown out. Like clockwork, Cassidy grabbed her iPod and knit cap. Breathing deeply to try and keep her composure, she headed into the woods in deep reflection. She made it a few paces into the woods before she tore out her headphones and let the sorrow erupt out of her in a guttural cry that tore at the silent curtain of the forest. Her legs quivered and threatened to give out, while her body was racked with sobs that Cassidy could neither control nor contain. The soft thud of a car door from her driveway breached the forest edge, spurring Cassidy onward into the forest to find peace. Her tears flowed incessantly as she thought back on years of Thursday night dinners, the fireside talks, and her grandmother's stories and lullabies. She eased the headphones back in her ears, trying to escape from the sadness, but her mind was consumed with the last story her grandmother had told. Perhaps it was the only story she told with more than a kernel of truth. Cassidy reached for the necklace, which she usually wore under her shirt, and pulled it to the surface. In the same fashion as the old lady, she twisted it, fingered and stroked the necklace, while she continued to trudge through the forest, absorbed in the memories she hoped would never fade. The sun began to creep towards the horizon, stretching its last beams of light lazily through the treetops. Cassidy realized her absent mind had led her down an unfamiliar path long ago. She turned off her iPod and tried to get her bearings, but darkness was settling in with wrapping, twisting shadows that reached out to consume the last bit of light. The calm sounds of the forest had transformed into an ethereal stillness when she had been lost in her own mind. As panic began to take hold, Cassidy's stride became longer and quicker in the hopes that she would find a road or a familiar path to lead her back. The more she searched, the less decipherable the woods seemed to her. After what seemed like hours, she spotted the soft glow of a light through the trees. Cassidy followed the light until the forest thinned and the woods opened to a meadow with a tiny cabin situated in the center, lights blazing warm. She hesitantly approached the house to knock on the door in search of help. Just as she lifted her hand to knock at the door, she heard an old wobbly voice singing in a foreign tongue. Cassidy paused for a moment, flashing back on an image of her grandma sitting by the fire of her tiny, rickety house, singing the same song in what she called Gaelic. Bringing herself back to the present, she felt a sense of comfort knowing that this mysterious voice was singing a song from her past. She tapped at the door, and the voice stopped. Cassidy could hear the creak of a chair as the owner of the house rose to answer. She held her breath, hoping the owner would be as kind as her grandmother had always been. The door cracked open, and a tiny, decrepit woman was revealed. The old woman was so shriveled she reminded Cassidy of a raisin. Her coarse gray hair was gathered in a bun so tightly that it pulled back the wrinkles at her eyes slightly. On first glance, the woman's eyes seemed dark and foreboding, but then she smiled, and hundreds of wrinkles folded and multiplied into thousands upon her face. Upon seeing the young girl obviously distressed, the old woman invited her in from the darkness, introducing herself as Maggie. After seating Cassidy at the fireside, the old woman teetered over to a pot on the stove. "Tea? Coffee? A bit of whiskey to warm you up?" Cassidy couldn't help but feel at home, safe and comfortable by the fireside once again with an old Scottish lady. She accepted the coffee with a splash of liquor and began a conversation with the old lady, recounting how she became disoriented in the woods. After Cassidy mentioned her grandmother's recent death, the old lady's head bowed in respect, and she began to inquire about the girl's family. "And what a beautiful necklace you have there. Was it your grandmother's?" the old woman crooned. "Actually, yes. She received it as a wedding gift before she left for America when she was younger." Maggie's eyes narrowed, and her smile slipped into a grimace for a moment, but Cassidy was too busy looking at the necklace in her hand to notice. "It's the only thing I really have of hers, except my hat that she knitted before I left." Cassidy suddenly felt the full weight of the news she had received earlier. Her grandmother was dead. She unconsciously began to play with the necklace, twirling it in her fingers and feeling the rubies along its length. "That's a shame, dear, but it's quite exquisite. May I have a closer look at it?" Maggie leaned towards the girl, reaching out towards the necklace expectantly.